In this video, we are going to discuss a very interesting game played between Caruana Fabiano versus Magnus Carlsen from the Tata Steel Chess Masters 2022 round number 12. This game is very interesting because Caruana Fabiano and Magnus Carlsen are just two top world-class players. Magnus Carlsen is the world champion and Caruana Fabiano is the one who challenged Magnus Carlsen in the 2018 World Championship match. So definitely they have interesting rivalry between them. So it's going to be very fun to discuss this game. So let's check it out. So Caruana Fabiano with the white pieces started out the game with 1 e4 and Magnus Carlsen replied with c5, the Sicilian defense. Knight f3, knight c6, and we have the Rosalima on the board, bishop to b5. Not going for opening up the position by playing the open Sicilian, but going for the Rosalimo. And we have g6, developing the fianchetto bishop, the standard variation to play the Rosalimo. Castle by white, bishop to g7, c3, and white idea to play d4, having a very nice center. Knight to f6, you can't play d4 because the knight is hitting the pawn. Rook e1, castle, and here we have d4 by white, opening up the center and having a very nice center as well. d5, Magnus strikes back in the center, battling d5, hitting up the pawn on e4. The pawn on d4 is hanging, the bishop can develop on g4. So Caruana decided to push the pawn to e5. White is definitely having much more space in the center now. And the bishop on g7 looks to me pretty bad because of the pawn on e5 and d4. Knight to e4, bishop to e3, defending the pawn on d4 and also developing the bishop on e3. We have trade in the pawn and in the center, and here we have queen to b6, and it looks like it's kind of a French defense structure where you play e6, put your pawn to d5, and you play c5. But okay, currently the pawn is on e7, so that's the profit. At some point you can go for developing the bishop. Here we have queen b6 hitting the bishop and the pawn. So Caruana decided to play queen e2, defending the bishop, and the idea is second that the queen is also protecting the pawn on b2. So at any point the bishop can move from the b5 square. Bishop to d7, bishop to a4, rook to c8, knight to c3, and here white is already preparing to capture the pawn on d5. So we have a knight trade. Queen goes back to d8. The reason black went back with the queen was because white is already preparing to play rook b1, hitting the queen and the pawn. That is why we have queen to d8. Bishop to b3, idea is to attack the pawn on d5. And here we already have knight a5 by Magnus. Knight a5 looks like why black is simply giving up the pawn on d5. In the game we have rook to c1, not going for capturing the pawn on d5. You can't go for capturing the pawn on d5, it's definitely a fine move. And the game continues by playing bishop to f5, hitting the bishop and the pawn. All those who were thinking what will happen if black directly goes for capturing the pawn on c3, you cannot go for capturing the pawn because white is now better by playing bishop to d2, hitting the rook and the knight, although the knight is defended by the queen. So we have rook c2, and here white comes up with a very interesting and powerful move. e6, opening up the position, hitting the pawn and the bishop. You can't move the bishop because I can simply go for capturing the f7 pawn. So black is forced to capture the pawn, and we have a minor pieces trade. And after king h8, rook a d1, white is better in this position. The reason white is better in this position is, first of all, white pieces are all developed. Light squares are incredibly weak, so I can play knight to g5 followed by knight f7, which is very deadly for black. And the e7 pawn is also very weak, which gives white a very comfortable position. So we have bishop to f5. The right variation is to play after bishop into d5 is to play bishop to f5, hitting the bishop. We have c4 defending the bishop, e6, and after e6 the bishop is trapped on d5. But here comes the move, bishop to g5, hitting up the queen. Queen goes to d7, bishop to e4, knight into c4. We have a bishop trade, and after rook a c1, knight b6, queen d2, knight d5. It's an equal position, although it looks like White is definitely having a very nice center control, but in the exchange, the d4 pawn is actually very weak. So it looks like a Grunfeld type of position where black puts pressure on the pawn on d4, and I think black is actually very comfortable because white will be always having some problems on this d4 pawn. So that was the reason perhaps Caruana decided to simply play rook to c1 because he wants to keep the bishop bad on g7. Yeah, and he is also having this very nice center control. Knight into b3, a b3, queen b6, hitting the pawn, queen a2, a5, advancing the pawn to a5. Perhaps the idea could be to play a4 at some point, or perhaps followed by queen a6, b5. Queen a3, putting pressure on the pawn on e7, rook e8, and here we have c4. So white is definitely having a very nice center, and Caruana is going for opening up the center because white is having the center. dc, bc, and it definitely looks like after d5, the queen is attacked and white is actually very comfortable. So personally, by looking at this position, it looks like white is first of all having a very nice center control. White pieces are very nicely placed. At any point, white can push the pawn, hitting the queen, and it looks like white is already better. But it's an equal position. Magnus simply played queen a6, simply hitting the pawn on c4. And after playing queen a6, white is already feeling very uncomfortable because the pawn on c4 is attacked. You don't want to play something like c5 because it weakens up the light squares very much, and black is having the light square bishop. But actually, you are having no other option, so we have c5 by Caruana Fabiano. Because if you go for defending the pawn on c4 by playing something like queen a2, I can simply go for playing b5. You don't want to take because after queen b5, or you can say bishop b5, doesn't matter. The pawn on d4 is already very weak, and you are not having so strong center because now the c4 pawn is gone. And in this position, if you try to even play c5, now I'm still having this white squares under control by the black white bishop, and I'm already having two passed pawns on the a file and the b file. So black is the one who is better in this position after e6. Okay, so that was the reason queen a2 was not a good move, and white was actually kind of forced to play c5 in this position. Bishop to c6, developing the bishop and also controlling these light squares. Rook b1. So after playing rook b1, Caruana is saying to Magnus that I doesn't care if you want to go for capturing my knight on f3 with the bishop, because you simply lose the control of your light squares, and in this position white is simply better. My idea is very simple. I can simply play rook b3, rook b6 followed by rook b1, and simply putting pressure on the b7 pawn as you having no light square bishop. That was the reason Magnus keep the bishops on the board, because bishop is doing a very nice job protecting everything. Rook c1, rook d8, knight d2, queen e2. And here's my question. You don't need to find the best move from the white side, but you need to find the idea from the black side. What was the reason black played queen to e2 in this position? What is the reason? Okay, so feel free to pause the video and try to find the idea of playing queen e2. What is the idea behind playing queen e2? Okay, I'm sure that you must have had a deep thought and you must have come up with this excellent move, or you can say excellent exchange sacrifice, by finding the idea rook into d4 is very powerful from the black side. The idea of playing rook into d4 is, first of all, let's check it out. We have f3 by Caruana Fabiano, which was the first mistake you can say in the game. The best move was to play knight to f3, defending the pawn on d4. And if black tries to capture the knight on f3, you definitely don't want to capture the bishop, or else black is simply better. A pawn up, light squares are weak, and black is simply winning. But after bishop into f3, we simply have rook to b2 hitting the queen, and the queen is actually forced to go back to a6. And here I can simply go for capturing the bishop, and white is actually better in this position. But we have f3, and here comes the move. All those who thought this idea, rook into d4, congratulations. Bishop into d4, and here after queen into d2, what is happening is, although black gave up the rook for a pawn and the knight, But in the exchange, you can say the e5 pawn is extremely weak. The bishop on d4. You can say white position is starting to collapse because black is having the bishop pair, having the full light square control. And black is already putting pressure on the pawn on e5, on c5. So it looks like an equal position, but actually black is the one who is comfortable in this position. Game continued by playing rook to d1, queen to f4, queen b4. So Caruana idea is to trade the queens. So here we have e6, bishop c3, and he decided to trade the queens, and Magnus captured another pawn on e5. If Caruana would have captured the queen with the rook, defending the pawn on e5, here we have bishop to f8 hitting the pawn, white plays bishop to d4 defending the pawn, rook to d8, now it's a very deadly pin, and black is already prepared to capture the pawn on c5. You cannot capture because the rook is hanging. So white is forced to play rook to c4 defending the pawn, a3 now, king f2, a2, rook a1. If you try to go for capturing the pawn, I can simply play rook to a8 defending the pawn, and after rook c2 I can even play bishop d5 defending the pawn, and here white can never ever go for capturing the pawn on a2, and I can simply infiltrate with the rook, and I'm simply better in this position. Black is simply winning. That was the reason perhaps Caruana decided to give up the pawn on e5, but I think perhaps rook into b4 would have been a nice try. Rook, bishop into b4, bishop into e5, and now we have bishop and 2 pawn for a rook. So in the material wise, it's an equal position, but black is having the bishop pair. I'm pretty sure that you all know that bishop pair is actually very powerful. So we have bishop a3 and here we have bishop to f6. So here black is already very comfortable. Yeah, it's like a dream position for Magnus Carlsen. He knows how to play this position perfectly. We have king f2, bishop to e7, putting pressure, rook to b6, and here in this position there is actually no weakness for black. Black is defending the pawns, the bishop is protected by the pawn. There is not a single weakness for black, so that white can go for attacking the pawn, attack that weakness, but there is not a single weakness. We have rook c8, rook d2, f6, and here Magnus decided to open up the position, f4, e5. We have a trade, the pawn is isolated, but here we have a check, king e1, rook to f5. Even black can even go for playing something like e4 because the bishop is protecting the pawn, and it's all comfortable. Rook f5 defending the pawn, rook to b1, e4 finally advancing the pawn, rook c1, bishop goes with a check, g3, and now bishop goes back. Rook b1, rook f3 hitting the bishop, bishop goes to c1. Idea is to exchange the bishop, but Magnus know that if he tries to exchange the bishop, then it's still winning for black, but as we know that bishop pair is very powerful, so we have bishop to f6 keeping the bishops on the board, rook to b6, rook to f5 putting pressure, bishop a3, king f7, rook f2, and here we have rook f3 by Magnus. He can even go for trading up the rooks, followed by this king e6, bishop d5, bishop d4 check, and it's still winning for black, but he simply played rook f3 hitting the bishop. And here Caruana decided to trade the rooks, king f1, and here we have bishop to d4 by black. Idea of black is very simple. Black wants to play bishop to e4, give a check to the white king, and the pawn is invincible. White can never stop this pawn. That was the reason after playing bishop to d4 on the move number 49, Caruana Fabiano resigned the game, and Magnus Carlsen, after playing bishop to d4, very interesting move, decided to win the game, and now he have became the champion of the Tata Steel Masters 2022, the 8th time I suppose, or you can say the 7th time. I exactly don't know, but he won the game and he actually won the tournament. This was a very interesting game, and the knowledge that Magnus Carlsen have, he know how to play this position. At many times, you can say the lower level players or even me, things like always get nervous when we go for and exchange sacrifice. But Magnus Carlsen knows where to sacrifice the piece. He went to sacrifice the piece. Just let me get to the position. Yep, the position where Magnus decided to sacrifice the rook for the knight and the pawn. It looks very interesting, but it's actually very hard to find on the board. Yep, and when you are playing such a big tournament. So this was the interesting game played between Magnus Carlsen and Caruana Fabiano, and I'm much sure that you must have liked this game and you have learned, if anything, something new. Then make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are new to my channel, because I'm always going to come up with these interesting videos like this. And make sure to share this video with everyone. So I'm going to come up with these interesting videos for you. So till then, stay tuned and keep watching OneShot Chess.